When it comes to asset protection, not everyone needs a fancy offshore asset protection trust, but also insurance alone is usually not enough. And if you think you don't have any assets, think again. Your current W-2 income and your future W-2 income are valuable assets that you should try and protect. So in this video, we're going to talk about the 6 layers of asset protection. Why layers? Well, as a former asset protection attorney, I often think of asset protection as layers, similar to having layers of clothing. So for example, if you go out on a nice sunny day, it's probably okay for you to wear a t-shirt and some shorts. But as it gets a little bit cooler, you may need to have a longer sleeve shirt or maybe a sweater. And then of course, it gets really, really cold. You're going to need a jacket. And if it's wintertime and there's a blizzard, you're going to need a winter coat. So similarly, your asset protection structure and your strategy will depend on whether you have nothing more than a W-2 job and maybe a little bit of real estate, or whether you have, 8 figures of net worth and a really high risk job. So depending on where you are in life will dictate how many layers and what combination of layers of asset protection you will need. So without further ado, here are the 6 layers. Layer number 1 is actually the free variety. There's actually a free layer of asset protection, so I couldn't think of a better one to start with free. And those typically come into examples like, your homestead exemption, for example. There are some states that actually protect a portion of your equity in your home already. Sometimes it's automatic. Sometimes you actually have to do an application. Sometimes it only protects you if you file for bankruptcy, but each state has different numbers. A lot of the states have very little amounts of protection for your home. So let's say usually it's less than $35,000. I mean, the purpose of these statutes really are to make sure you're not completely thrown on the streets and you get turned into poverty when you're doing these. But then there are other states, like, as you guys know, the states of Florida, that have full homestead exemptions. So you're able to protect the entire value of your home, which is the reason why people go to states like Florida for the asset protection piece. Similar with, 401k plans, for example. If you got a 401k or a pension, that's typically protected automatically from asset protection creditors. Again, I like to give the example of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson, not only after he owed, I don't know how many, I think he owes over $100 million now, but he ended up going to Florida because number one, his home in Florida is completely protected from the creditors. And also he's got an NFL pension and the pensions are completely protected. So layer number 2 is insurance. As much as I have my issues with the insurance and the insurance industry, insurance is always the first line of defense. And whatever you come up afterwards is really your backstop in the event that insurance isn't enough. And most of the time insurance isn't enough because it's got so many holes in it. I've done several videos now on insurance, but my issues with insurance is that there's a lot of exclusions in them. So even though you're making your monthly payment, your premium payments, when it comes time to actually collect, that insurance may not be there. It's also a really good product for small claims. If somebody slips and falls and you've got you've got court costs, you've got to defend yourself, that's fine. But when it comes to really catastrophic things, which is really what I really try and pay attention to, like if somebody literally slips and falls in your rental property and dies or gets severe injuries, or maybe a boiler explodes in your rental property, severely injuring people, or maybe you get into an auto accident. Those are kind of the catastrophic things that I look for, and insurance a lot of times isn't enough. People's premiums aren't very high a lot of times. So people have like $1 million insurance policy, which is great, except if you get into a car accident with 4 people and kill a couple people, or even worse, they're quadriplegic for the rest of their life. And then the $1 million is not going to last too much. It's not going to go that far, especially since most of these policies are also, by the way, what I call self-cannibalizing, meaning you're going to spend money on your defense, your attorneys, they're going to rack up $100,000 in fees, and that's going to get deducted. So you may end up with something more like a $900,000 policy. But again, sometimes when you have a catastrophic event, especially if you're a real estate investor, insurance just isn't enough. And so you want to have that next layer of protection, meaning what happens if insurance isn't enough? That was your first layer of defense. What's your next backstop? We're going to talk about the next backstop in a second. Layer number 3, I'd like to call privacy. Now, privacy isn't necessarily an asset protection tool in the sense that it doesn't actually protect you per se, meaning just because you've hidden something from public view, or it's hard for people to find your assets, doesn't mean that they can't go after them. But the first thing a plaintiff's lawyer generally will do before even considering suing you is they're going to do an asset search on you. They're going to look for all your bank accounts. They're going to do a bank account sweep. They're going to do a brokerage sweep. They're going to do a real estate sweep. They're going to look for assets. And if they can't find anything, plaintiff's lawyers typically don't like to go after cases where even if they have a really good case, there's no assurance that they're going to be able to collect. And they typically at that point will just look for the insurance policy and then settle for insurance limits. And the reason for that is that most, if not all, plaintiffs lawyers work on a contingency fee basis, which, if you guys know, they don't get paid unless you get paid, right? So the last thing a plaintiff's lawyer wants to do is go spend the next 2 or 3 years of their life pursuing this case, winning the case, maybe even dealing with an appeal and winning the case at the end of the day, only to find out that when they start looking for assets to collect, there's nothing there to collect. They just don't want to do that. And one of the key points that most people are not aware of is that collection and your ability to pay a particular lawsuit is completely separate and irrelevant to the lawsuit. So they can't ask you during the lawsuit, how many assets you have, do you own real estate, how much, what's your bank account? All those questions are really irrelevant to the actual proceeding. It's only until you actually get a judgment. So step one is to get a judgment. Once you have a judgment, then step two is to collect. And during the collection phase, you're able to bring somebody in, do a deposition, ask them about all their assets, and at that point, try and discover. But up until that time happens, which could be 2 or 3 years, the plaintiff's attorney is not going to be able to, if they can't find anything on a public record, they're not going to be able to ask you or request documents showing that. So it's a really powerful tool to, I don't say hide, but to transfer assets into some form of entity that is not attached to your name, so that when they do an asset search, like a bank sweep, for example, they might find your bank account in your personal name, but the bank account that really has all the money is in a separate entity that doesn't have your name and therefore won't show up on an asset search. So privacy is a really big deal, especially when it's combined with some of these other strategies or layers. The fourth layer, or layer number 4, is going to be the entity structuring, or LLCs. That's the one that probably you guys are most familiar with. Like once you start acquiring some form of assets in terms of some real estate, you generally want to create an LLC or some other entity, but it's generally LLCs for real estate. And the reason for that is you want to separate the ownership. You want to separate your name from the asset for 2 reasons, really. Number one, you're trying to protect yourself from the asset, meaning if something were to happen to that real estate, something were to happen to that business, something were to happen to that particular asset, you don't want to be the owner of that, because if you're the owner, you're going to be the one that's legally responsible for whatever happens. So real estate, since everybody here is real estate investor, if somebody, even if it's not really your fault, and somebody just happens to slip and fall on your property, or a guest comes onto your property, to your rental property, they slip and fall and they get hurt, then they're going to sue the owner of the property. And you want to make sure that you are not the owner, that the owner is some sort of an entity, generally a limited liability company. On the flip side, you want to protect your assets from you. You are a walking liability. Every day you get up and you go to work, you go into your car, you go do something, you are a liability producing machine. So we want to make sure that if you get sued, irrespective of your assets, irrespective of your real estate holdings, for example, and the classic example is the car accident. So, or if you run somebody over, or there's a business dispute, you get sued unrelated to your assets, you want to make sure that those assets are protected. So you want to create some kind of an entity structuring, which we've done a lot of videos and episodes on that before. But layer number 4 is going to be entity structuring, or LLCs. And then layer number 5 is going to be your asset protection trust. Probably the gold standard, especially if you go offshore, of asset protection. Now, when I say asset protection trust, we're not talking about your living trust. We're not talking about the estate planning tool, because a living trust is a revocable trust, which means you can change it at any time. You can add beneficiaries, take away beneficiaries, change the terms. Because it's a revocable trust, which is what a living trust is, it has no asset protection value whatsoever. So that's one of the biggest mistakes. I always hear people say, well, do you have any protection? It's like, well, I have a living trust and I put all my assets in the living trust. Living trust purely is an estate planning tool. It's there to avoid probate, which is a whole different topic. But from an asset protection standpoint, a living trust has no asset protection value. What we're talking about here is an asset protection trust, which is an irrevocable trust, meaning once you set up this trust, transfer the assets in there, you cannot revoke it. You cannot change the terms of the trust. You cannot do any of that, which is what gives it that asset protection feature. You can go offshore for some asset protection. You can go onshore. If you're going to go onshore, there are certain asset protection states that are better than others, so to speak. And Nevada is probably the most well-known asset protection state there, primarily because their statute of limitations is so short. You can only challenge a transfer into an asset protection trust in Nevada for a couple years. And so after that, there's no way you can challenge the transfer of your assets in there as a fraudulent transfer, which is one of the ways people get around it. So again, asset protection trust. Honestly, if they were handing out asset protection trusts for free, then I would say everybody needs one, or everybody should go get one, because it's a far superior tool than just having LLCs or just having insurance. The challenge, of course, is that they're not cheap to set up, right? A domestic asset protection trust may cost you $10,000 to $15,000, plus you've got to pay a trustee in whatever state you're living in. So maybe that's another couple of grand a year. And then offshore, it can be as high as $30,000 or $40,000. Again, it really depends on the size of your estate. If you're just there with a couple of rental properties and your estate is worth a couple $100,000, you're probably not going to get an asset protection trust. But as you grow and grow and grow your portfolio, certainly as a real estate syndicator, you might think about that because of all that exposure that you have. You know, if you've raised millions and millions of dollars, those are all potential exposures from the limited partners. So just something to keep in mind of. Generally look at how dangerous your profession is. Again, the example of the heart surgeon, somebody who's a heart surgeon is going to have a much higher chance of getting sued than a content creator on YouTube, for example, right? So just depending on what you do for a living, and then also how much money you have to protect, you may want to consider layer number 5, which is the asset protection trust. And then finally, layer number 6 is what we call equity stripping or liens. This is sort of the really advanced kind of stuff. So the idea that you actually place liens on your assets. The home is a great example. Let's say you have your home and you have a ton of equity in your home. One of the things you can do is quite simply go get a loan from a bank or a home equity line of credit, get a loan, remove that equity from your house, put it in a safe place, a bank account over here in some other entity, and the bank will then put a lien on your property, probably a second lien on that. So you've actually effectively removed the equity from your home. And if somebody were going to try and take that away from you, well, you've got your first mortgage in place, and now you have a second mortgage by a particular bank or a particular equity line of credit. And then what we typically do for asset protection stuff or other assets is we just create our own bank. We create our own LLC that we control, that we own. We then go ahead and make a loan to ourselves. We make a lien on our sort of a friendly lien on our assets, and that way we're able to strip away the assets. Think of it as a business as well. A lot of times you have a lot of expensive equipment or any assets in a business. Well, you can strip away those assets and put them in a different place and simply lease it back to the business, or maybe you give some kind of a contractual relationship for you to be able to use those assets for the business, therefore removing the ownership of the asset away from that property. Those are the 6 layers of asset protection. Quite honestly, depending on where you're at, what really works best is some form of combination of all of these. Again, insurance accompanied with LLC, that to me would be sort of my minimum layer, would be an insurance policy along with an LLC. Privacy, you can add that to add some stuff. If you're going to do an equity stripping strategy, that works really well with asset protection trusts, because the trust would then create some sort of a lending company that would then make the loan or the line of credit to your business in exchange for that lien. So the lien holder would be underneath your trust. So just a combination of all of these things. But the most important thing, I think I would say this, the time to do this is before anything happens, right? There's an old saying from, I think it's a John F. Kennedy quote that says, the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining, right? Before it starts raining. Robert Kiyosaki likes to say the time to put your seatbelt on is before the accident. And so even though it would be nice to wait until something catastrophic happened to then go out and get insurance on it, or go out and create an LLC and transfer assets, at that point it's too late, because we have something called fraudulent transfer laws, which means if you transfer something knowing that there's already a claim out there, or you should have known that there's a claim out there, then that transfer can be voided by the judge, reversed, and it goes back to your name and therefore can be collected. So the time to do this is beforehand. But again, not everybody's going to need to do the fancy equity stripping and the lien and the asset protection trust. You know, if you're a real estate investor, you've got some properties, you're probably in the camp where you need some insurance along with an LLC and maybe a little privacy in there as well. So it's harder for plaintiffs' lawyers to actually find all of the properties that you own. But what I would not do, and I think that's ultimately sort of the point I wanted to make this video, is that I don't think insurance is enough. A lot of people just say, just get an umbrella policy, let's just do that. Yes, you should have insurance, but there's way too many holes in an insurance policy, either holes or just the limits are too low, that it doesn't give you the appropriate protection that you need. You want to add another layer. And again, depending on where you are, it will dictate how many layers you do. So if you enjoyed this clip and you want to see the entire episode, click here. And if you want to see other videos similar to this, click here.